rate. Well, annually, Australia's population grows by about 1.6%. And it's not just because of more babies being born. The greatest number of increases come from migrants entering the country. If you were reading the Australian newspaper over the weekend, you might have noticed this ad. It's just the latest in a push from prominent Australian businessman Dick Smith, calling on the government to cap Australia's population growth. Dick Smith joins me now from Sydney. Dick Smith, thank you very much for coming on the show. You and I have spoken about this issue in the past. You call it a Ponzi scheme. You say we've got to rethink both our migration rate and our overall population rate. You make the shrewd observation that there is actually no population plan for this country. No business wouldn't have a business plan. So how can a country not have a population plan? What do you think needs to change?
Well, I think there needs to be a plan. I mean, it's pretty obvious that you can't grow forever. It is a type of Ponzi scheme because our economy requires this endless growth in the use of resources and energy and more people. That's ridiculous. Surely it must be able to live in balance.
The government says that they'll halve the population growth. This is the growth rate, and they'll obviously be reducing migration. Net overseas migration will be reduced. Permanent migration will be reduced. But that's not a decision they've taken soberly against a plan they don't have. This is all because of the pandemic. Now, surely, now that the borders have shut, wouldn't this be the ideal time that we rethink where we're headed?
I couldn't agree more. It's absolute. Look, the property industry and the universities want us to go back to these record migration levels. That's utterly ridiculous. There's a good message in what's happened, and that is that you have too many people, you don't have enough jobs. And Judith Sloan pointed out in The Australian that record immigration quite often means Australians can't get jobs.
And we know the issue. Poll after poll show that Labor voters, Liberal voters and, surprisingly for some, Greens voters all support a rethink about our migration levels. So why is Canberra not listening?
It's really interesting. I think the business lobby is very, very powerful, but 8 out of 10 Aussies from the surveys I've seen say we should have a population plan. Now's the time to get a plan because we're in a position where we obviously don't have a large number of migrants coming in. Maybe we should stick at that.
You and I talked about this issue before, and we talked about the real problems we have for young people coming through the system, and particularly with higher and higher immigration and you know, big population push, that those lower skilled jobs are disappearing. Automation's making things very different and difficult for people, I have to say. And then obviously this push on population. This could end up with an Australian workforce that's much smaller and more Australians permanently unemployed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With automation and with robotics, there's going to be less jobs, not more. That's why it's important that we end up capping our population at some sensible level. If we reduced our immigration to 75,000 a year instead of the record 200,000, we'd end up with about 30 million Australians. I think that's okay. You mentioned the present growth rate of 1.6%. That'll take us to 100 million people when our grandkids are still alive. That's not sensible.
Well, it's not sensible, particularly because we can't build any more dams and we're not having a reasonable conversation about energy. All of those things matter. I've got to ask you about manufacturing. You know, you are someone who is very credible in the area of manufacturing. There's been a lot of talk in this COVID crisis that we need to rethink manufacturing, get it to come back to Australia. I keep saying that's all good and well, but you've got to understand why they left in the first place. The Australian Manufacturing Workers Union Chief Paul Bastian said we've got to have a Buy Australian campaign. He also wants federal governments and state governments to spend more on Australian goods procurement, more of the taxpayer dollars on Australian goods. Can we restart manufacturing in Australia? That's the first point. And if we can, how do we make it happen?
It's going to be difficult to restart manufacturing because we share the wealth better here. We have one of the highest average wage, minimum wages in the world, so it's hard for us to compete with places like China. But I think more and more Australians are patriots and saying, let's support the home team. That's very, very important. As you know, I had Dick Smith Foods. In the end, I had to close it down because we simply couldn't compete with the cheap imports that companies like Aldi and Costco were bringing in.
So this is I've often said, you know, we'll never compete with Asia on wages, but we always, once at least, could compete on energy cost. And they're the two big components in manufacturing. So if we can't rethink wages, and I don't think we pay Australians less, I think we've got to rethink energy. And just on that, if we do go ahead and we rethink energy or we bring back manufacturing to Australia, do you think Australian consumers are prepared to pay a bit more? I mean, they say they are, but are they when it comes to push and shove?
And that's the whole key to it. It will be slightly more. Yes, look, with good leadership, Australians would do that, because look at the situation we're in now. We're being criticised by China quite unfairly. I think now is the time for our Prime Minister to say, hey, support Australian-owned and Australian-made.
I've got to ask you this, you know, in the middle of this whole debate about manufacturing, has anyone in Canberra picked up the phone and rung you and asked you to be involved in thinking about how we get this right?
No, not one person. I'd love to be, but as you know, I'm interested in aviation reform as well. They don't even ask me anything, so it's a real pity. I mean, there's lots of people like me who could add something to our country, something worthwhile, but we're not asked.